Story 1. Macbeth killed Duncan in battle, not in his sleep, and by all accounts he was a decent king of Scotland. The play was Shakespeare's way of flattering the Stuart dynasty. Story 2. Charles Lightoller was the most senior officer who survived the Titanic disaster. He is mostly remembered for interpreting Captain Smith's order to evacuate as women and children only, which led to the deaths of most of the male passengers. He was portrayed unfairly in James Cameron's film Titanic, with one scene showing him threatening to shoot the passengers like dogs if they did not obey orders, an event that did not occur. After the disaster, he gave an honest testimony and did not shy away from taking responsibility. He was the one who stood up in court and said they were reckless to keep the ship at speed on a calm sea where icebergs would be difficult to see. He later campaigned with the British Board of Trade and other maritime organizations to create new mandatory regulations, basing lifeboat capacity on the number of passengers and crew instead of ship tonnage, conducting lifeboat drills so passengers know where their lifeboats are and crew know how to operate them, instituting manned 24-hour wireless communications on all passenger ships, and requiring mandatory transmissions of ice warnings to ships. These regulations are still followed today. In May 1940, he heard about the evacuation at Dunkirk on the radio and jumped in his personal yacht, the Sundowner, saving 127 men. He was a remarkable man. Story 3. You know that dingo ate my baby woman? Turns out it did. It absolutely did. But we only found that out years after she was internationally ridiculed and convicted of murder. The poor woman and her family. Story 4. Peter Lustig was a popular German children's television presenter whose legacy was damaged by Bild, Germany's biggest tabloid newspaper, because he refused to collaborate with them. They fabricated stories about him, claiming he disliked children, and spread these rumors widely. Although they were sued and forced to issue a clarification, the correction has not reached everyone. Many people still believe the accusations even after his death, which is unfortunate. Bild ruined his final years and was never properly held accountable. Story 5. Anne Boleyn. And tried to leave court when King Henry VIII took an interest in her. It was a position her family had worked hard to secure and one she had trained for. Yet she retreated to Hever Castle to escape his interest. Surviving letters from King Henry VIII show that he continued to write to her after she had left, wondering why she was refusing his gifts and not sending responses. He would stay nearby at her cousin's estates and ignore her polite refusals. Eventually, he traveled to Hever with an offer of marriage. She agreed to marry Henry and was reviled for it. Her contemporaries attempted to paint her as a vile, opportunistic seductress who enthralled the king. In reality, she was relentlessly sexually harassed. It is possible she kept those letters to prove she had done nothing wrong. What many people tend to forget is that Anne was deeply pious. It is likely that she learned to accept her fate, as it provided her with the influence to make the kind of reforms she believed in. Indeed, it is possible that she played a significant role in the Henrician Reformation, and famously became one of the two wives that King Henry VIII executed. A promising new alliance fell apart when Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire refused to ratify their marriage. She also had a falling out with her closest ally at court, Thomas Cromwell. Henry was already smitten with Anne's lady-in-waiting, Jane Seymour, most damning of all, and had failed to produce a male heir. Historians generally agree that the evidence of Anne's adultery was likely fabricated by Henry as an excuse to be rid of her. They nearly unanimously agree that the accusation that she had an affair with her own brother is entirely made up, despite it costing George Boleyn his life. He gave an impassioned speech at his execution, stating, "Trust not in the vanity of the world, and especially in the flattering of the court." Henry made sure and had a terrible time locked in the Tower of London, where it is reported she had a restless night before her execution. He left her body lying in the square for some time, as proper burial arrangements had not been made. In his lingering resentment, he tried to erase her from history and court. She became a maligned woman of Tudor history, one who still fascinates popular culture today but only when portrayed as a scheming seductress. She is perhaps one of the longest examples of slut-shaming through history, a victim of sexual harassment, a pious and devout woman who vowed to be no man's mistress, not even a king's. For the crime of not bearing a male heir, she died and lives on as a media mockery of her true self. Her last laugh is that the undesired girl she gave birth to went on to become one of England's greatest queens, Queen Elizabeth I. King Henry VIII brutalized his wives in his obsession for a male heir and became surpassed by a woman instead. This can be seen as a form of karma for N. Story 6. Richard Jewell. Not only did he not plant bombs at the Olympic Games in 1996, he was actually the hero who alerted authorities that there were bombs in the first place. Story 7. Frederick II was also known as the spawn of the devil. People did not think highly of him, but he was actually a decent leader to his people. Either the Pope of that time did not like him and spread rumors which eventually led to that nickname, or he simply wanted the land Frederick owned. Story 8. Bruce Ismay, the chairman of the White Star Line and the antagonist in James Cameron's Titanic, was the gentleman who said that people wanted to marvel at the speed of Titanic and encouraged Captain Smith to sail faster. In reality, Ismay would not have had much, if any, input to Smith, and if so, Smith likely would not have heeded Ismay's advice, as Smith was nearing retirement and would not have taken advice from a businessman. Alternatively, Ismay knew that he was in capable hands and would never impose upon the captain by telling him how to sail his ship. Survivors testified that during the sinking, Ismay was trying everything he could to assist with filling the lifeboats. He convinced passengers to get into boats and at one point had to be told by an officer to stop trying to help as he was getting in the way. Ismay took a vacant seat on one lifeboat just before it was about to be lowered, which was one of many empty spots on that particular lifeboat. Ismay was a scapegoat because he was the highest-ranking survivor of the sinking, and he became a recluse afterward. As another testament to his character, he created several charities aimed at helping families and survivors of maritime incidents. Story 9. Draco, the author of the first Athenian legal code. The word draconian, implying unduly harsh or punitive measures, derives from the historical reputation of the legal code he wrote, which prescribed death as the sole option for most criminal infractions. At the time he was writing, Athenian society only had death, exile, or shunning as viable punishments. He was exiled from Athens due to the backlash against the work he was commissioned to perform by the Athenian Assembly. Story 10. Alfred Nobel. People assume he invented dynamite to be used as a weapon and blame him for the millions of war deaths since. They say it is ironic that he created the Nobel Peace Prize. He was from a family of miners. His father and elder brother both died in gunpowder accidents, so he wanted to create a safe explosive that would not detonate if accidentally dropped. He was literally trying to save lives. Story 11. The woman who sued McDonald's after hot coffee caused severe burns. Her injuries were extensive, and the McDonald's coffee cup melted due to the temperature. Story 12. Anir. The copper ingots were just fine. Nanny wanted a better deal and asked to speak to the manager. Story 13. He is not considered a bad person, but Braveheart was very unfair towards Robert the Bruce. He was a greater hero than William Wallace, as I understand it. Story 14. Was totally expecting removed. Story 15. Monica Lewinsky. She was an intern pressured by one of the most powerful men in the world. She did not deserve to be made the villain. Story 16. Machiavelli is reviled for The Prince, because he essentially promoted what everyone at the time privately practiced, taking advantage of a specific opportunity that arose in Italy. His discourses are far more detailed and closely reflect his views. They provide context for much of The Prince, so I do not recommend reading The Prince without also reading the discourses. Story 17. When human immunodeficiency virus first emerged, a team of researchers worked tirelessly to understand the situation, traveling across the country to various hotspots to investigate. They knew that gay men were becoming ill and dying, and they wanted to find the cause. One suspected factor was poppers, which were popular in the gay community. The initial working name for the disease was gay-related immune deficiency. Now, some individuals criticized this early naming with disdain, interpreting it as evidence of prejudice. However, the researchers were dedicated to uncovering why these men were dying, and their efforts should be recognized. Story 18. Friedrich Nietzsche was a kind, humanistic person who hugged a horse that was being abused and feuded with Richard Wagner over his anti-Semitism. His works were taken out of context by the Nazis and others. Story 19. My stepdad Robert. Sure, he wasn't my biological father, but he treated my mom and us children well. Story 20. Marie Antoinette was most likely just an overly sheltered rich woman who was used as a pawn in a political marriage and then ridiculed when asked about topics she had no real knowledge of or power to change. Not saying she was a good person, but we do not know what she would have done if she had not been sheltered from the suffering of her people or had married for love instead of familial obligations. Story 21. Hey original poster, just by reading your username, I feel like you were looking for a specific answer. Story 22. Cracker Barrel fired Brad's wife and never heard the end of it. Story 23. King George III. As an American, I was taught to see him as the worst of tyrants, but he actually was a fairly decent monarch and a very interesting person, although he suffered from mental illness. On the other hand, Thomas Jefferson, whom I was taught to revere. Story 24. I just think Medusa, who is often seen as a villain, has a story of victimization and injustice. Her story reflects the consequences of trauma and the complexities of power dynamics. Because of that, the curse turned her into a monster with snakes for hair, causing anyone who looked at her to turn to stone. Story 25. The iceberg from the Titanic was simply minding its own business and suddenly got blamed for everything. It was literally a hit and run. Story 26. Monica Lewinsky broke away from federal agents who were trying to get her on the record against Bill Clinton. She sneaked away and tried to call Clinton's secretary, Betty Currie. Currie was at lunch and missed the call. The federal agents eventually got a statement from Monica. Clinton did not know, and Clinton lied to the federal agents. If Monica had reached Currie, the world would be a completely different place. Story 27. Courtney Love. There are many valid reasons to dislike her. I love her music, but some of her actions and statements range from wild to indefensible. However, I do not believe for a second that she killed Kurt Cobain or orchestrated it. The amount of hate and vitriolic misogyny directed at her is huge and constant. Their daughter even experiences residual negativity and has horrible things said about her. Kurt Cobain was a committed feminist, and I think he would be deeply disgusted by the things said by people claiming to be Nirvana fans. There is also the matter of publicly exposing Harvey Weinstein. On the red carpet of the roast of Pamela Anderson, while impaired, Courtney gave young women in Hollywood important advice. If Harvey Weinstein invites you to a private party at the Four Seasons, don't go. This greatly damaged her acting career. She was struggling with substance abuse at the time, but the advice stood as sound. Story 28. The Central Powers. I am not saying I agree with them. I just see World War I as more nuanced compared to World War II. Story 29. Antonio Salieri. The movie Amadeus portrays Salieri as a jealous composer who resented Mozart's success as their contemporary, but the film takes liberties with their relationship. In fact, all accounts indicate that they had mutual respect for one another, with Salieri even teaching Mozart's son at a young age. Amadeus is a great movie, but it does not give enough credit to Salieri's character or his music. Story 30. General George Thomas was a Virginian who fought for the Union in the American Civil War. He performed brilliantly and is considered a hero by most Northerners. In the South, he is vilified. Story 31. Captain Bligh's punishment and discipline were harsh by modern standards but mild by contemporary standards, if not lenient. Offenses aboard that he punished with lashes could have been punishable by death in the late 1800s. He also performed one of the greatest feats of navigation in history and was able to keep every member of his crew alive by the time they reached East Timor over a month after being set adrift from the Bounty. He navigated over 3,000 miles of the Pacific Ocean by memory. He learned well from his mentor, Captain Cook. Story 32. Richard Jewell was unfairly criticized. Story 33. Machiavelli would be shocked and saddened to know his name is synonymous with tyranny and pure evil. He was a staunch supporter of republics and a savvy politician. Story 34. Captain Hazleworth of the Exxon Valdez did his best to get the ship fixed, but Exxon refused. The crew was tired, He asked for relief and Exxon refused. He relieved himself of duty and let the executive officer take over with a green crew. This was not uncommon but not a good idea. Bligh Reef had no markers and the Coast Guard had funding cuts, so no monitoring of the Valdez was in place. When the event happened, he said, "I need a drink." The media portrayed him as a wily drunk sea captain who steered the ship himself into the reef. He had no alcohol in his blood during or after the event and honestly did the right thing as a mariner. He paid his dues physically and financially. From people I know who met him, he was actually a good person. Yet he is portrayed as the Adolf Hitler of the environment. However, it was a terrible case, but it created an opportunity to develop pollution control methods to help contain and clean spills. It created entire industries and laws to help the environment. I also met many people who helped clean up the spill and towed the ship, whom the news demonized. Exxon renamed and then sold the ship. It changed hands a few times and was scrapped in the 2000s. Meanwhile, there are cases like the El Faro where the captain did not try to avoid the hurricane. Worse, the plan was to call the office before abandoning ship. I would rather be fired than be at the mercy of someone whose closest experience to a boat is a gravy boat. There were also multiple oil rig disasters that caused many lives to be lost and millions of barrels of oil spilled into the ocean. But Captain Hazleworth was not a drunk pirate. Story 35. Not sure if he is seen as a bad guy because of what he achieved, but many people believe Ernest Shackleton foolishly led an Antarctic expedition that ended up in dire peril. Everyone was saved, including the ship's cat, through a series of adventures almost too impossible to believe. The truth is that Shackleton was asked to lead the expedition, but he refused. He said it was the wrong time of year for the voyage and that it would end in disaster. The British Admiralty was so eager for the expedition to go ahead that they sent a different boat and crew. When word reached Shackleton at his country home, he immediately set off on a rescue mission, needlessly putting his own life and that of his crew at risk. Those unfamiliar with the rest of the story should investigate. It is possibly the greatest story of survival in the most adverse conditions in recorded history. Story 36. Vlad the Impaler gets a bad reputation. He is well known for impaling people on spikes, but he mostly did this to prisoners who were already dead. He used this method to scare the Ottoman Empire from invading his land. He placed impaled bodies by the road the Ottomans were traveling to frighten them from attacking his territory. It worked, and the Romanians remained free instead of becoming another colony of the empire. He is a hero in Romania, but many people think of him as evil. He was simply clever. Story 37. The Emperor Domitian was painted by historians as a monster, but in reality, he simply angered the senatorial class, the group that funded or wrote the histories. Story 38. Julius Caesar was not all that bad of a person to his own people. He regularly gave money to the poor and paid his army well. He was stabbed to death because he threatened the power of certain members of the Senate and held many ideas that favored the general population over the members of the Senate. He was also very intelligent and a good leader. His death is tragic. Story 39. Sacco and Vanzetti. Today we are sure they were innocent. Story 40. I will give you the opposite. Gandhi was racist, pedophilic, manipulative, homophobic, and generally rude. His entire stance on pacifism leading to the British Empire leaving India is false. The British mostly retreated from India because of Bhagat Singh, a fighter and leader responsible for countless attacks on the British. Mahatma Gandhi merely rode a high horse alongside Singh's cavalry. Story 41. Neville Chamberlain, Prime Minister of Great Britain from May 1937 until May 1940 when he resigned during World War II. Unfairly labeled an appeasement advocate when he signed the Munich Agreement with Adolf Hitler in September 1938, which ceded control of the Sudetenland region of Czechoslovakia to Nazi Germany. He has been hated and mocked ever since. The reality was that he knew in 1937 that war with Germany was inevitable. Britain was not prepared and would have lost any war with Germany. Therefore, he undertook the largest peacetime rearmament the world had ever seen. In 1938, when he signed the Munich Agreement, Britain was not ready for war, so he needed time, and had no choice but to agree to the Munich Agreement. Unfortunately for him, Winston Churchill, a direct descendant of the Duke of Marlborough, believed it was his destiny to be prime minister and to lead the nation in an existential struggle for survival. Churchill used every political tactic to unseat Chamberlain. In September 1939, Nazi Germany invaded Poland, which made Chamberlain appear ineffective. Churchill used this to further his own political ambitions. But Chamberlain knew he had no choice. War with Germany had arrived whether Britain was prepared or not. Britain and a reluctant France declared war on Germany. The British dominions of Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and India also soon joined the fight. The United States stayed out for another 2 years, and Churchill never ceased mocking Chamberlain to achieve his goals. The fact is that without Chamberlain's determination, Britain likely would have been conquered. Without him, there would have been no squadrons of Spitfires or Hurricanes, no radar, no modernized navy, no revitalized army, and no system of coastal defense. Sadly, he died in November 1940, a broken man who had heard every bit of the derision against him. Ironically, when some British parliamentarians made jokes about him in death, perhaps out of guilt for their actions, it was Winston Churchill who spoke in his defense. Story 42. Richard III did nothing wrong. He was the first victim of the Tudor propaganda machine. The same applies to the Earl of Warwick. Story 43. Count Dooku was tricked and was correct that a Sith Lord was controlling the Senate. Story 44. It is commonly thought that Saigon execution by Eddie Adams in 1968 reflected a cold-blooded murder of a youth in the street, but that is not the case. The first thing to know about General Lone, seen shooting the gun, is that he was exceptionally good at his job. Universally respected by his men, he had led combat operations against the North, both on land and as a pilot. He rose to the rank of brigadier general on merit, rather than through nepotism common in the Saigon government. Many times, Lone intervened to limit the violence of American combat operations in the Mekong Delta, and he was among the strongest voices in Saigon for asserting South Vietnam's sovereignty in its dealings with the United States. On the morning of the Saigon execution photo, when Van Lem's death squad had just killed 34 people, 7 police officers, 2 or 3 Americans, and several police officers' family members, all bound at the wrists and shot in the head over a pit. They may have been looking for Lone himself. Legally, this placed Lem in a difficult position. He was not wearing a uniform, was not engaged in battle, and had evidently committed a major war crime against General Lone's subordinates and their families. As a war criminal and terrorist, Lem had no protection under the Geneva Conventions and was eligible for summary execution when caught. Eddie Adams' Saigon execution photo appeared in numerous newspapers worldwide, stripped of context and presented as a war crime caught on film. Without knowing who the victim was or why he was shot, the public assumed he was a random civilian murdered by a bloodthirsty sadist. Story 45. The Luddites who destroyed industrial equipment in England at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution had good intentions and were folk heroes. However, today the term Luddite is used as a pejorative for a person who resists new technology, implying they are stubborn and unreasonable. Historically, Luddites were actually advocates for better working conditions. They targeted only the equipment of factory owners who treated their workers poorly. Story 46. Nero did not cause the fire in Rome, was not actually in Rome at the time, and when he found out about it, gave permission for the refugees from the fire to use the palace grounds while the burnt parts of the city were rebuilt. Story 47. Doubting Thomas. The disciple of Jesus who couldn't comprehend the idea that his friend was alive after being crucified. When, for days earlier, his friend Jesus was about to be executed, Thomas uttered the most loving, heroic line of all time. "Let us also go, that we may die with him." Thomas was genuine, yet we use doubting Thomas as a slur. Thomas was truly devoted to Jesus. Story 48. I am here to say this. Almost the entire Black Panther Party. The group was started to save lives, stand up for the oppressed regardless of race, creed, or socioeconomic status, and was vilified as a terrorist organization based on racist ideology and J. Edgar Hoover's intense opposition. They were largely ignored until they began gaining serious support from non-Black groups through solidarity. Then they became a serious threat. For example, the reason free lunch programs exist in schools today, available to everyone regardless of race, is because the Black Panther Party initiated them on the principle that no one should go hungry. The government opposed this until they recognized its value, both financially and politically, and then adopted the idea. Gun control was not a significant issue until they started monitoring the police, and the courts rarely used lethal force, mostly making a show that they would no longer tolerate abuse. The bottom line is their work was never finished, but they existed in a time that was not ready for their efforts. This is why standing for the national anthem is often given more importance than standing against police brutality. Story 49. Albert Blythe was a private first class of Easy Company. He was portrayed as a coward in the television miniseries Band of Brothers. On screen, he was shown being shot and killed by sniper fire as part of a story arc. This portrayal was largely due to the other members of Easy Company never knowing what happened to him after his injury. In reality, he returned home and lived his life until the Korean War, where he fought and received the Bronze Star and Silver Star. Eventually, he continued his military career until his death in 1967 from a perforated ulcer. Story 50. Neville Chamberlain. Peace in our lifetime was far less the result of naivety and mostly realpolitik. England's military forces were woefully under-equipped, and a Battle of Britain at the time would have had a very uncertain outcome. He knew the treaty looked bad, but England needed time to build up its air force. The people who vilified him were the same ones voting down his rearmament proposals in 1935, claiming it was baseless fear-mongering and a waste of money. Story 51. King Richard III is debated as either a child murderer or a genuinely good king. Story 52. Dr. Samuel Alexander Mudd was the doctor who John Wilkes Booth knew and went to for medical treatment after assassinating President Abraham Lincoln. The evidence was circumstantial that they were working together. His biggest mistake was not reporting the treatment to the authorities sooner. Booth's boot, engraved with his name, was found at Mudd's residence. He escaped the death penalty by one vote and was sentenced to life in prison in the Florida Keys. He tried to escape once but later became the prison doctor and saved many lives during a yellow fever epidemic. Later, he was pardoned and resumed his medical practice at home. This is the origin of the phrase, to be someone's name Mudd. Story 53. All the innocent women who were burned as witches but were probably just neurodivergent or simply did not want to be forced to do things that women were compelled to do back then against their will. Story 54. I would say Aaron Burr. Although he killed Hamilton in a duel, many people forget that Burr fought for the common person by supporting the abolition of the property ownership requirement for voting. He supported freedom of the press, women's rights, and advocated on behalf of immigrants. In contrast, Hamilton's Federalist Party supported laws that treated non-Anglo individuals as second-class citizens and even attempted to ban them from holding office. Story 55. The man who developed the germ theory was villainized, mocked, and discredited to the point of committing suicide. After his death, his theory was validated. It always makes me sad to think about. Story 56. Much of this thread involves people refuting half-truths and misinformation with other half-truths and misinformation. It makes for an interesting read, though. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.